What if the past had turned out differently?
The Green Bay Packers have won the Super Bowl.
I was told that playing in Green Bay was not an option.
With the 24th selection in the 2005 NFL Draft, the Green Bay Packers select Aaron Rodgers, quarterback, California.
And Mikowski appears hurt. Mikowski's in great pain, Ahmad.
And reliable sources now tell CBS Sports that Parcells is very close to accepting a Green Bay Packers offer.
Gentlemen, let me introduce to you the new head coach of the Green Bay Packers, Mr. Phil Bengtson.
What would the past look like? What would the future look like if? And that starts the What If segment. And this week's topic was actually submitted via Twitter by Chris S. Krieger. What if the 2002 Packers had ended up with the NFC's number 1 seed? So Chris, we definitely appreciate you sending in that. So now let's go to the backstory for this What If segment. When New York Giants kicker Matt Bryant sailed a 39-yard field goal through the Meadowlands uprights on Saturday, December 28, 2002, not only did he drop the NFC best Philadelphia Eagles to 12-4, he created a rare opportunity for the Green Bay Packers. Defeat the Jets on that very field 24 hours later, and Green Bay would secure home field throughout the NFC Playoffs for the first time in 7 seasons. It wouldn't be easy, as the New York Jets were red hot, having won 6 of their last 8 games behind first-year starting quarterback Chad Pennington, and they still had an outside shot at winning the AFC East title. But the Green Bay Packers entered Week 17 at 12-3, tied for the NFL's best record, and had clinched the first ever NFC North title by December 1st. Brett Favre was having a season that many felt would win him his 4th MVP award, and the Packers defense had forced an NFL-high 45 turnovers. If they could defeat the Jets, the Packers would be 2 Lambeau Field wins away from Super Bowl XXXVII. Unfortunately, the team that took the field against the Jets was a shell of the 2002 Packers that had done all those great things. The team's depth had been decimated by injuries. They were missing both starting tackles, Mark Tauscher and Chad Clifton, and more importantly, All-Pro safety Darren Sharper would be a late scratch for the game with a knee injury. Sharper entered Week 17 as the NFL's leader in interceptions. The Packers' pass defense couldn't recover. The Packers fought hard and only trailed the Jets by 4 points at halftime. However, they would lose Pro Bowl wide receiver Donald Driver to a shoulder injury. The Jets would go on to score 3 touchdowns on 3 straight drives in the third quarter, and the Packers had no offensive answer. New York would defeat the Packers by a final score of 42-17, clinching them the AFC East and forcing the Packers to return to Lambeau Field 6 days later to take on the upstart Atlanta Falcons. Of course, they would lose an uninspired, mistake-filled game 27-7 and hand the Green Bay franchise its first ever postseason loss at Lambeau Field. A season that had shown as much potential as any since the Super Bowl years in the mid-90s was over. But what if the Packers had found a way to beat the Jets? Would they have been able to ride the Lambeau magic to another Super Bowl title? If so, what happens to the legacies of Mike Sherman and Brett Favre? And where might the team be now? What if the Green Bay Packers had defeated the New York Jets on December 29th, 2002? All right, so there's the introduction to this week's Packers What If. And Matt, before we get into this, going back and researching for that intro just reminded me how frustrating that Jets game was. I know we've had so many games that have been worse since then with 4th and 26 and the Moss Moon game and pick your Giants playoff loss, but do you remember how awful that game was to watch back then?
Yeah, for whatever reason it just sticks with me. It's just one of the more vivid memories I have of, some of the older games or games from that season. I remember this was like classic you and I watching the game together. I remember you storming upstairs at about halftime, and I think probably watching it upstairs because you couldn't handle it anymore, and I'm stuck downstairs just hoping, they pull off the comeback and just being, completely ignorant and trying to watch them, fight back. And I remember Terry Glenn having a touchdown. Yeah, that was an extremely frustrating game and it filled right into the Atlanta game with how bad we played that week. It's for whatever reason how good that team was that year. We just hit a wall in Week 16, it seemed like, and just couldn't do anything after that.
All right, I guess I'll begin here and talk about what I think might have happened if we changed this. Obviously, the big thing that both you and I remember about this season was Darren Sharper missing that game and then subsequently missing the Atlanta game. I don't know if it's a quote we made up or if it was based upon some real thing he had said, but do you remember him mentioning that I want to save myself for Tampa?
Yeah, that's absolutely not something we made up. I
just thought maybe we embellished it over the last 10 years.
I'm pretty sure that was the exact quote. I remember them talking about that too, in the coverage at the time. But yeah, I mean, nothing was more frustrating than that, having to play against an Atlanta team that was a 6 seed but was still a good team, and Michael Vick was, their quarterback, and they were pretty good, and to just, save yourself for the next round of the playoffs just seemed absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that's when I really kind of changed my tune a little bit on Darren Sharper to the point where he was a really phenomenal player, but when he left, I can't say I was that upset about it. But getting back to what we were talking about, if he could have found a way to play against the Jets, I think there's a chance that they could have beaten them. Obviously, the Jets were very hit and miss offensively that year. They had a really high-efficiency passing game, but they didn't score a lot of points. So I think that they could have won that game had Sharper played. Obviously, they had a ton of injuries that year. That's the year both Clifton and Tauscher both had season-ending knee injuries relatively. Tauscher very early, and then Chad Clifton about midway through the season. But let's just say they find a way to beat the Jets. Let's say maybe the Jets aren't inspired because they can't clinch the division because of the, I believe it was Patriots-Dolphins game going the other way around, and then let's say the Jets are uninspired and they don't beat the Packers. The new seeds in the NFC that year would have been Packers 1 seed, Philadelphia 2 seed, Tampa Bay 3 seed, San Francisco 4, Giants 5, Atlanta 6. It would have been Atlanta at Tampa and then the Giants at San Francisco. Obviously, the Giants at San Francisco happened, so let's leave that game alone and say San Francisco triumphs again. Atlanta and Tampa Bay, Michael Vick was a phenomenon in 2002, but he could do nothing against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They lost to Tampa in 2 very, very lopsided games that year. And in actuality, Michael Vick didn't fare very well against Tampa Bay his entire career. Even when Tampa was lousy and Atlanta went to the NFC Championship game in 2004, they roughed him up pretty good there too. So I think it's safe to say that Tampa would have beaten Atlanta, so therefore Green Bay in the second round would have hosted San Francisco. Tampa would go to Philadelphia, and I would say that the Packers, San Francisco wasn't a very good team that year. They were 10-6, but they played in an awful division. San Francisco and the Packers, I think the Packers would have won that one easily. Tampa Bay and Philadelphia, that's a tough call. Let's just say Tampa wins again because that's what actually happened that year. Packers and Tampa in the NFC Championship game is a real tough one to call. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers only allowed 12 points a game that year. The Packers allowed over 20 points a game that year. Offensively, Tampa wasn't anything to write home about. They were 18th in points scored. They were 24th in yards. Brad Johnson was very efficient, was 6th in passing efficiency, but they were 27th in rushing and 27th in yards per carry. Packers led the NFL with 45 turnovers. I think the Packers could have beaten the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and gone to the Super Bowl that year, where they would have faced the Oakland Raiders, who had the second best offense in football. They're the best all-around team in football. Of course, Rich Gannon won the MVP award that year. It's hard to unremember Rich Gannon's horrible Super Bowl performance, but the Packers would have been able to get healthy over that week off. They would have had Darren Sharper back. Donald Driver would have been healthy again. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that if the Green Bay Packers beat the Jets, they win the Super Bowl in 2002. And then as far as what happens to the future of the franchise, it throws a monkey wrench into everything. But this one, unlike the other two that we talked about, which is why I was glad Chris sent this in, this is different than the other two. It's almost more of a pick your poison type of deal. Not pick your poison, pick your potion maybe is a better way to go. If they win the Super Bowl in 2002, I don't see them winning it in 2010. But having been a Packer fan through that entire period, 15 years from now, does that matter? Maybe it matters now because it's not as fresh anymore, but Mike Sherman's probably, if they win a Super Bowl, Mike Sherman's still here. And remember that he probably would have still been the general manager. We wouldn't have got Ted Thompson. We wouldn't have gotten Mike McCarthy. But is Mike McCarthy really that much better of a coach than Mike Sherman? I guess is the question I'm going to ask. If you change this playoff and let's say they win 3 games here, Mike McCarthy is 5-3 as a head coach in the playoffs. If everything else in Mike Sherman's head coaching career stays identical, except this year they win the Super Bowl, Mike Sherman is 5-3 as a playoff head coach for the Green Bay Packers. I am saying that if the Packers would have beaten the Jets, they would have gone on to win the Super Bowl, and the Packers today would be different. They might not be as positioned to win the Super Bowl in 2012, but as far as the history of the Packers, it's unchanged. It just maybe rearranges some of the championships. I can't say that's worse. It might not be as good. Having won a Super Bowl 2 years ago is a lot more fun than the last time having won it being 10 years ago, but I don't know. And who knows what happens with Brett Favre. Maybe Brett Favre's still the quarterback if Mike Sherman never left. But I guess that's my thought. I think if the Packers beat the Jets on December 29, 2002, they win the Super Bowl in 2002, and then your guess is as good as mine.
All right. Well, I'm pretty shocked to hear you say that. I guess I didn't expect the Super Bowl prediction. But, yeah, I mean, as far as your follow-up with that, everything changing and kind of swapping around is probably right. Because if Sherman had won the Super Bowl, you're right, he probably would still be here barring, a couple of horrible seasons, maybe after 2005. And, maybe Brett would still be around, probably not. But we probably wouldn't have Aaron Rodgers, you would think. Mm-hmm. Just everything completely changed. You can't even start to fathom, the differences that would have occurred had we won that Super Bowl. Mm-hmm. But as far as what I think would have happened,